fire and added enough wood to coax the embers back to life. Then she stripped out of her sodden clothes and wrapped a wool blanket around her shoulders. She winced. Oops. That was probably more detail than a 15-year-old boy needed to hear about a 15-year-old girl. She continued, more mindful of the particulars she shared. Kathy? Her father's voice cut through the silence. Rolling thunder sounded on its heels. Kathleen cringed. Yes, Da. Everything all right? Why are you up, lass? Just checking the light, she called, and then pulled the scratchy wool tighter around her, sending up a silent prayer that he'd accept her answer and go back to sleep. She inched closer to the fire, aching for the heat to reach her bones. Moments later, her father's snores once again echoed through the room, and the tension she carried between her shoulder blades released. He was having a good night. Kathleen grabbed a kettle, filled it with water, and hung it over the fire. While the water came to a boil, she rubbed her hands together, trying to turn her blue-tinged nail beds pink. Once she'd downed her tea and her fingers burned white-hot with renewed circulation, Kathleen went to her father's desk and pulled out his sacred book. This is our livelihood, he'd told her 100 times. A lightkeeper is only as good as the records he keeps. She paused and looked at the boy. Now listen close. It might not sound like much, but this is the moment Saint May was born. He nodded, eyes wide. Into the book, she poured her account of the night, how she'd woken with an inner urging to check that all was well along the coast, how she'd climbed those endless spiral stairs, chiding herself for venturing into this unkind weather without cause. That was when the light beam had glinted off the overturned dinghy being tossed about in the storm. She wrote of the waves that had crashed over her own vessel as she maneuvered her boat. Not just anyone could have managed swells like that, especially not someone as young as herself, be they male or female. But 15-year-old Kathleen had honed her skills on the water since her father had taken up his post at Bleak Point Island when she was a little girl. Everything had been preparing her for that night. Her first solo rescue at sea. She continued pouring her heart and soul onto the page, telling how the inebriated man had nearly capsized her when he'd grasped at the oarlocks to pull himself aboard. Though the skiff had tipped wildly, Kathleen had kept a cool head, despite her knowledge that a merciless sea cared not whether it was a drunkard or a teenage girl dumped into its depths. She'd calmed the cursing, thrashing man and coaxed him around to the stern like she'd seen her father do so many times before. And she'd saved him. Scarf and storm concealing her identity, she motored him to Ocracoke before disappearing back to her remote island home. At the bottom of the log page, she impulsively signed a name she wished was her own. A person she craved to know, but who was little more than a legend to Kathleen. A person who, if they were there, would know how to help her father. But hadn't the night's events proven she was equal to the task life had handed her? As long as she continued doing whatever it took to conceal the fate of the real keeper of Bleak Point Light, everything could stay as it had always been. The girl stared at the page on which she'd poured out the events of the evening, all written in her scruffy hand instead of mimicking her father's writing, as she normally did. Ever so carefully she removed her account from the precious book, leaving no trace of the torn-out page. As far as anyone knew, this rescue never happened, and that was the way it must remain. She walked to the fire with the page in her hand. It would make better kindling than anything else. She stretched the paper toward the licking flames. I am not but a figment of a drunk man's imagination, she said to the empty room. But instead of releasing it so that the fire could claim it, she clutched the paper to her chest, holding tight to the memory. The woman opened her eyes to the young boy whose face was creased in concentration. Why was she scared for her father to find out? And why did she need to keep what she did a secret?